There are two directions of the worship service this morning. We have been swept up in magnifying and worshiping and loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, with every clashing cymbal and horn and voice that we could possibly raise, right? This is the first of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, all the ways to love God. And the other tablet of the Ten Commandments is the direction now the worship service turns, and also love your neighbor as yourself. And to find the ways that out of the love of God that we then reflect that in service and love of God to loving of our neighbor. So that's the dimension that we turn now. Last Sunday, were you here last Sunday and maybe over the last several weeks as our pastor's been leading us through this wonderful study of fruitfulness. And last Sunday, the corporate sponsor of the worship service was Allstate. Not really, but there's the great illustrations that Doug used from the mayhem and all of that. And it got me to thinking, of course, that I don't think there's anyone more creative with their commercials than the insurance companies. I mean, they just outdo each other. They're all so clever. There's mayhem, and then there's, this British accent gecko, and there's Flo, and there's Peyton Manning. I mean, they bring the big guns out, these insurance companies. I mean, they're really great at this. But you know what? What's the most successful? The largest of all the insurance companies, larger than all the others, in fact, double and even triple in volume of the next to them in competitions. A way distance between number one and number two in both the areas of auto coverage or casualty and loss or home coverage. You know what the biggest, most successful of them all is? It's State Farm. State Farm. And they don't even have a gecko. What they have is 9 little notes. That sound familiar? And like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. That was their 1971 ad campaign. Must be a lonely job to be in the ad agency of State Farm. They kept it for 45 years. So while everybody else was going online and had all the snazzy kind of stuff, just State Farm kept plugging away with those 9 notes. And the idea, the DNA, the ethos, the way they tried and in fact did build their company was to say, you don't just have to go online and find us. We're actually across the street. That neighborhood State Farm guy or gal was the genius, I guess, of the company. And wherever they were, we're your neighbor. We're going to be, if it's a bad thing, we're going to be there for you. If it's a good thing, we're going to be there celebrating with you. We're your neighbor. Not flashy, not snazzy, but apparently it works. They're not the cheapest, but everybody seems to think neighbor pretty well matters. 45 years, the same little jingle, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. The person who wrote that jingle was a young guy who studied at Juilliard. I mean, he's a really excellent musician, but it's hard to make money making music. You have to play in church and all kind of stuff, and so it's hard to do it. And so this brilliant musician has to, he's writing jingles, like he wrote one for Kentucky Fried Chicken and Dr. Pepper, and, I am stuck on Band-Aids because Band-Aids stuck on me. That's one of his. And you deserve a break today, so get out and get away to McDonald's. That's right. So he's a jingle guy, and so he writes those 9 notes, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. And they paid him $500. I mean, that paid his bills for at least that month. His name was Barry Manilow. I don't know whatever happened to the kid, if he ever made it or not. But State Farm's on to something, because it really matters to be a good neighbor. Being a neighbor is really, really important. And actually, way before they were focusing on that, so was Jesus. Our text this morning comes from a story that is so familiar and common, maybe the most common or most familiar of all the stories that Jesus told, but it's the story of the Good Samaritan. But when we hear it in the context, which was in answer to the question from a seminary professor. I say that because the Bible will say it's a lawyer, and we instantly think of an attorney. The lawyer means a student or teacher of the law, meaning the law of Moses. So this is a religious professional who teaches people, think seminary professor, teaches people about the Bible. And this is the person who comes up to Jesus, and being a professor, he likes to give exams. So just then, a lawyer, a professor, came up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, Well, what's written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And you should love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, A+. You've given the right answer. Now do this, and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, or perhaps in order to narrow down how many people he has to be neighbor to make this realistic, he says back to Jesus, well, now who is my neighbor? I mean, how far does this have to go? And Jesus said, hey, let me tell you a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that same road, and when he saw the man, the victim, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw the victim, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. And he went to the man and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And then he put the guy on his own animal, and we brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. And the next day, he took out of his pocket 2 denarii, 2 days' worth of labor, and he gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him. And whatever else you spend beyond this, I'll repay it when I get there. Now, which of these 3, Jesus said, do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the professor said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, bingo, go and do likewise. This is a reading of God's word. So what's it mean, this business of neighbor? It must be pretty important. This was Jesus's favorite verse. You got a favorite verse in the Bible? Well, Jesus did too. His favorite verse in the Bible, that is based on how often he quoted it, was Leviticus 19:18, and love your neighbor as yourself. This verse gets quoted almost the most of any Old Testament verse in the New Testament. It's in all 3 of the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and multiple times. Paul picks it up. He quotes from this verse in both Galatians and Romans. The book of James picks this up and talks about it as a royal law that sums up all of the others. It's in Hebrews. It is the permeating trickle throughout the entire New Testament, but it's anchored in Jesus himself. He quoted this again and again, and maybe because it's so hard to get it learned, we have to learn it. So it's his repeated mantra, love your neighbor as yourself. It's a very important text, very important. And the reason is because it's really hard for us to do it. We keep narrowing down, and God keeps wanting to open us up. So what is this about? A lot of people struggled on this, and some people have figured it out. Here's one, for instance. This is a kid who was actually overweight as a kid. The bullies taunted him and called him Fat Freddy. He had asthma, plus being introverted and shy and all that. He spent a lot of time as a kid playing by himself in his room. Didn't have many friends much, didn't go to the playground. So he'd create little puppets and little imaginary games and songs. And that became fruitful, actually, a little bit later. He was from Pittsburgh. Can any good thing come out of Pittsburgh? This is my last Sunday, by the way. And not only was he from Pittsburgh, he was an ordained Presbyterian pastor. So it's happened twice. It's like lightning striking twice. An ordained Presbyterian pastor from Pittsburgh. His name was Fred Rogers. He was ordained after seminary, and his pulpit would not be this pulpit. His pulpit would be a television screen. He felt called, and he was ordained by that presbytery in Pittsburgh to use his life in the service of the gospel, gathering children, nurturing children. Now, he didn't wear a lapel cross pin. He didn't open up the Bible all the time. You might not have known he was a Christian, much less Presbyterian, but This was actually his pulpit, because what he believed and loved in this authentic, natural, understated, undertone kind of way is that kids could tell authenticity, and he just nurtured children for an entire generation. For 35 years, he had this Mr. Rogers neighborhood. And every time, every episode would end, and he would say to the children, "You are so very special. You've made this day special. There's no one in the whole world just like you, and I like you just the way you are." And this from a kid who spent his childhood with nobody liking him just the way he was. There are those who give away more than they received, but their suffering is actually the crucible that helped them know how much it mattered. And so he would speak with children, and the show couldn't have worked, really. It had no pizzazz or glitz. It had talk about basic. And this little trolley, that could never work. In an age of all kind of fascinating and other kind of children's shows, it just plods right along. He took on some pretty controversial subjects. He helped children thinking about divorce. He helped them try to figure out and help parents figure out how to talk to your kids when terrible things happen, like 9/11. He would say after 9/11, he would say, it was the last year his show was on the air, he would say, sometimes frightening things happen in the world. My mother always told me when that happened, always look for the helpers, because however scary it is, you'll always find helpers rushing in, and that'll help you know that it's still okay and it's still safe. Not bad counsel. And they repeated that again after his death, after the Sandy Hook elementary killing. They're always helpers. One of his most famous episodes in the 1960s, when in this country especially, people didn't think that mixed races should be in the same swimming pools, or for that matter, drink from the same soda fountain or water fountain, or stay in the same hotels, or sit at the same diners. At that season of life, with us so far astray from what God meant, Mr. Rogers gathers up, and he has this little kiddie pool. He takes off his shoes and socks, and he sits at the edge and puts his feet in the pool. And he has one of the helpers from Pittsburgh to come join him. It's a policeman. Our helper's the policeman. And he puts his feet in the pool with him. What a wonderful day it is in the neighborhood. But the policeman was African American. And they're in the pool together. And without making a march or anything like that, he was subversively taking away the underpinning of the racism that was the great scourge, and in many ways still is, of our country. He was bringing health where there had been sickness, because we are not normally hatred, bigoted, or racist. We have to be taught to do that, and we can be untaught too. So Mr. Rogers created a really great neighborhood. As a result, he won 4 Emmys. 40 universities conferred upon him honorary degrees. George Bush gave him the Presidential Medal of Honor, Freedom. And at his lifetime Emmy, he stood up in front of the people, the glitterati of Hollywood, toward the end of his life. And here was how he spent his 15 seconds of fame. He said, "Would you think with me for a moment, every one of us had someone who loved us into being and so believed in us that that's how we got to where we are. Would you think of who those people are in your life while I do the same for me? Let's take 10 seconds in silence to do that." And he looked at his watch. And instead of a big old speech, he just let them write a speech of their own. And by the end of the 10 seconds, there was mascara running and clenched jaws that were shaking. And all of those older children of God began to be in touch again with their humanity. And he closed his time by saying this: "Would you think now about the smile it'll bring to the face of the person that you thought about them?" He had found his neighborhood, and he helped people find theirs. Well, this is a critical thing for us to learn. Will you be my neighbor? Is it really a wonderful day in the neighborhood? Jesus thinks it's important because it's going to be up to us to make sure it can be so, and it's one of the ways the kingdom of heaven comes to earth. So Jesus tells a story about a man, and it could have been taken from page 6 of the Jerusalem Gazette. I mean, it was very common, or it could have been just a story that would be on everybody's mind, because everybody in that day knew what it was like to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho or vice versa. If you've been to the Holy Land, you'll never forget that. Jerusalem is about 1,500 feet above sea level. Jericho is 1,500 feet below sea level. So in that 30 miles of winding road, you go down 3,000 elevation feet or up, whichever way you're going. But that road is a switchback road through the mountains that looks just, in fact, that's it. So it's a really easy place to feel dangerous, because it is. And most everybody who went on that road, besides being out of breath, it's because their heart was in their throat, because there were a lot of robberies along that road. It was an easy place behind those switchbacks for robbers to hide and wait. And so one day it happened. According to this story, a guy's just going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and sure enough, the thing that you always hoped that your mama told you might happen, well, it happened to him. And he's robbed, and he's mugged, and they take away all of his stuff. In fact, they strip him of all of his clothing, and they beat him within an inch of his life. In fact, they probably thought they killed him. Throw him in the ditch like litter on the side of the road and run off. Terrible crime, terrible. If he's semi-conscious a little bit, along comes a priest, and maybe his last thought was, oh, Lord, thank you, you've sent me a preacher. Oh, great. Because if anybody will care for me, it'd be a preacher, right? In fact, if the preacher, the priest, is going from Jerusalem to Jericho, most likely he's just come from serving in the temple. So he's just got his bulletin wadded up in his pocket. I mean, he's just come away from that. And so if anybody's ready to be generous, you'd think it'd be right after you came to worship, right? But instead, the priest sees the guy, realizes where he is, looks around, even gets more nervous, skirts around on the other side and goes on his way. Whoa. Well, then along comes a Levite. The guy beaten thinks, well, at least it's a worship music person. This is the Jeff Fox of the temple. The Levites were the ones who played the instruments and sang in the choir and all that. He's coming along afterwards, but it's because, of course, they leave church even after the preachers. And so he comes along now, and he's fresh from worship as well. But when he sees the guy, he also scoots around. Now, Jeff would always stop, but he scoots around as well. Now, the professor, the religious guy who's listening to this, he's a religious professional. He's thinking to himself, I know where this story's going. You're going to bash the clergy. Because the guy who's going to do the right thing is going to be a layperson. Going to be a Jewish layperson. It's going to, preacher, layperson. I get it. But instead, Jesus just pulls the socks off of everybody and says it's a Samaritan. Well, now, who are Samaritans? The Samaritans lived in the very center, sandwiched in between like the gooey part of an Oreo cookie, in the very middle of Palestine. Palestine shaped about the size and shape of Vermont. So Galilee, the northern Israel, and Judea, Jerusalem, the southern part, but right in the middle is Samaria. And the Samaritans were half-breeds. They were, from historical and lineage, half Jewish, but also half everything else Gentile, because when one of those older kings in the Old Testament came through and wiped them all out, he loved to kind of mix people up so that they could kind of be detached from their origin and root and family. And so he kind of created this mishmash population called Samaria. So they were almost Jewish, but not quite. And as a result, the Jewish people looked down on them because they were not pure. And there are a lot of people even to this day who grow up in mixed race families who have trouble finding their place. I don't really feel totally at home in either my mom or my dad's racial background. Sometimes you'll hear that kind of thing. Of course, if you've done one of those DNA things, you know that actually every one of us are from mixed race families. Because we're all mongrels here, all mutts. But anyway, the Jewish people thought, we're kind of right from the Mayflower. But anyway, they looked down on each other. And even though they were neighbors on the map, they were far from neighbors spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. Just like Israel and Palestine today, or Catholic and Protestants when they were in Northern Ireland, or Bosnia and Serbia and former Yugoslavia. I mean, sometimes the closest neighbors are the furthest apart. And sometimes it's even true right here in our country. There may be someone you have the most trouble being a neighbor to, though they live within your gated community, because they don't vote for the same person you voted for president. Can't figure out how to be a neighbor to them. You don't wish they'd just go move out somewhere. Sometimes it's hard to be a neighbor to some people, but we don't have any Samaritans here, I don't guess, maybe. But who are your Samaritans? Who are my Samaritans? Because you have to translate this. Who's the person that would make you say, "Sss"? Is it people who have a lot of body art and piercings? I'm not like them. Is it people who are from one of those countries and they wear these scarves and, I think they're all terrorists, Is it people who just don't speak our language? Well, they're not even Presbyterian probably. Is it people from a lifestyle that is repulsive to you? People different socioeconomically? We have all kind of ways to make sure we don't see them or be around them. We have gated communities and zoning laws and housing things that kind of make us not have to ever go through Samaria. But yet within 5 miles of where we're sitting, there are people in abject poverty. There are people in dangerous home situations. There are people who cannot figure out how to get through the next day. There are people who either are not at work, underworked, or cannot figure out, maybe they don't even know the language much. You don't have to go very far to find Samaria. Who are the people that are hardest for you and for me to cross the street to, that we don't really see as our neighbor? Because whoever that is, whatever kind of person that is, fill in that blank where this gospel says Samaritan. And Jesus says in the story, that's who ends up being the hero. Well, that was a surprise. Throughout the years when this story has been interpreted, all the way back to origin in the 3rd century, the thought was that Jesus represents the Good Samaritan. Jesus is the one who finally gets it. He's the one who picks us up. We're the guy in the ditch. Jesus picks us up and takes care of us and pays our debt and carries us to heaven eventually and all that kind of stuff. Puts us on the donkey, which I think represents the church, and he gets us all the way there. But actually, modern scholarship is more often saying, I wonder if the place that Jesus saw himself in this story might have been the guy in the ditch. Because the way that guy is described here will be used, the exact same words will be used later in this gospel for the description of what happened to Jesus at his crucifixion. He'll be among robbers. They will strip him. They will beat him half to death within an inch of his life, take everything from him, including all of his clothing, leave him for dead. Does that sound familiar? Wouldn't it be interesting if Jesus told the story saying, where am I in the story? I'm in the ditch. Which one of the passersby will you be? So in 1880, a man named Aimé Nicolas Barrault painted the painting you see up here in front of you on the screens. And in his painting, he kind of pictured a lot of what I think modern scholars are trying to say. He pictures the Good Samaritan helping the guy who had been in the ditch. But look at that guy who had been in the ditch. Does he look like Jesus to you? It looks like Michelangelo's Pietà, doesn't it? And it's like he captures a sense of what maybe Jesus was trying to say. I'm the guy in the ditch. And here's the exam question at the end, if you're into passing tests. Jesus said once in one of his parables, here's the one question we get at the end. Here's the final exam. Did you see me when I was poor and hungry and lame, when I needed to be visited, when I was on the downcast, when I was thrown away? Did you see me? Did you minister? Did you feed? Did you care? If you did, or if you didn't, the whole test runs on that. What about if Jesus is the guy in the ditch? What difference would that make? It might make a big one. What I try to do sometimes, and I'm not good at this, by the way, but I try to imagine to myself and see in that person in the ditch, I try to see something different than probably what the priest and Levite saw, which was, if I stop, I'll probably get robbed too. If I stop, it may just be a piece of bait and he may be in on the robber group, If I stop, I'll get my hands dirty. If I stop, I'll be late for getting home to be with my kids or to prepare the Bible study on the Good Samaritan story or whatever. So all those pretty good excuses. I mean, I don't stop and pick up every hitchhiker either, but sometimes what helps me to get past that, if I'll see in the person in the ditch, whether they've got a cardboard sign or whatever, if I'll begin to see Christ. I have a son who a few years ago was abusing prescription drugs and unraveled his life and all the kind of things that go out of that. And for a very brief while, he was homeless. And when I see a person in that situation, I'm more prone now than I used to be to say, you know what? I know it's not my son, but it's somebody's. What about if I even saw more than that and said, wow, that looks like Christ? I wonder what that would do in me. So what's it going to take for us to do this? Jesus simply thought that loving our neighbor was not only good for the neighbor, it's really good for us. Because Jesus wasn't ever doing fundraising, and we're not either this morning. We're doing people raising. And the joy and the dignity and the neighborhood of loving our neighbor not only redeems them, it redeems us. And it's so good. Jesus doesn't want us to miss it. Well, here's the poison, I think, that we live in that keeps us from doing this. At least this is my poison, and a lot of it I ingest, so you might resonate with some of it. Here are the things that keep me from loving my neighbor, keep me from seeing them or responding to them or rationalizing why I don't. Here's mine, my favorite sins. One of them is just simply greed. Just greed. I mean, I don't know what it is just about a little green piece of paper with a dead president on it, but you know, I like to put it in my hand and caress it like a grandchild. So precious. And if you try to take it, you know, I just grip onto it because this is mine, you know. This is mine. I worked for it. I saved for it. I invested. I took the risks. You know, while everybody else was being lazy, I was working. This is mine. And whether it's this or a deed or a car key or whatever, this is mine. That's misplaced. It's like, you know, like birds on the beach. Mine, 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 mine. You know, it's just missing the whole point. It's not mine. None of it's mine. None of it. Another thing that gets me is fear. I can't be helping everybody because if I do that, I'll run out. I can't go help them because I won't have enough, right? I don't know what's going to happen to health care. I don't know what's going to happen to my care. I mean, I don't know. Here's the number, but what happens? And no matter how much of it is, it's never enough. And the fear of that, the fear that God won't show up tomorrow. I know God blessed me up to now, but it's up to me from this point on. Oh, come on, really? When you say it out loud, how silly it sounds. Fear, fear. Another of my poisons is cynicism. Well, you know you can't help them because, A, they probably don't deserve it anyway. How'd they get in that place? If I gave it to them, no telling what they'd do with it. They'd probably buy drugs, right? All those good reasons that are truthfully just we didn't want to give. Cynical. Well, there's an antidote to the poison. There's an antidote, and here they are. Instead of greed, it's called gratitude. Gratitude. Because if I will practice, every time I want to say mine, which makes me just curl up, you know, if instead of saying mine, I'll learn how to say thank you, remembering that everything came as a gift to me. It was never mine. It was a gift. It all came. And yeah, I had to work some too, but it was a gift. It just rained down like rain on the just and the unjust. It was a gift from a gracious God and from a whole lot of other people who were a part of my life. It was a gift. My adult daughter wakes up every morning. She says, Dad, I write down 5 things I want to be thankful for that day. And it becomes her North Star all through the day. If we develop that kind of spirit, it's amazing how gracious life begins to be. I just want to learn to be thankful. It opens us up. It's like prune juice. To the antidote of fear, it's trust. Trust in God. If God was there yesterday, won't God be there tomorrow? Really? Is it really all up to us? Won't the same God who blesses because he wants us to become a blessing, isn't God going to show up tomorrow? It doesn't mean don't plan or be foolish, but it does mean be bold. You know, let it go on, you know, let what has come to us get through us. Just trust. And to my cynicism, it's just simply the example of God. How does God give? I mean, how does God give? When you look at how God gives, 88 times in the Bible, the noun God is followed by the verb give. John 3:16. God so loved the world that what? Yeah, right. That happens again and again in the Bible. God's a giver. It's what God does from all the way through. So Jesus told this great story about a sower of seed. I think I look good in khaki. And the sower has this kind of radical, joyous way of giving. And it's not the way I would do it. If I was going to sow seed, I would probably take one seed at a time, put it right into the ground and cover it up and water it, then go to the next one, just be very efficient. Don't want to waste any. I'd want to make sure the soil is good, all that stuff. Probably wouldn't get much done. But that's our kind of Western way of doing it. How does Jesus talk about the sower, this image of God who sows and scatters the seed? And of course, the seed, it falls on good ground and shallow ground and weedy ground and stony ground. Well, what does the sower do? Does he go find and do soil sampling to find out where the good ground is? No. He just kind of reaches in his bag and he says, hey, this is going to be great. Let's just throw seed everywhere. This is going to be wonderful. It's kind of hilarious and joyous all the way up in the balcony. It'd be great. And it's just kisses from heaven, and it rains down on us. It comes down upon us, and if I hit you, sorry, put up your umbrellas. Here you go, bases. And it's this beautiful gift of God, but notice the hilarity of it. God loves a hilarious giver, Paul would say. It's joyous and free and dance-like. And it's not all obsessed about, is some of it going to land on stony, rocky, thorny soil? I always used to hear that parable and think, I wonder which one I am. I wonder if I'm thorny or stony. All those kinds of soil are in just one field. And all those kinds of soil are in me. There's parts of my life that God's abundance has come and been wasted on because I wouldn't let it take root. But just every once in a while, some of God's goodness hits a good place. And the most amazing fruitfulness, what Doug's been preaching for 3 weeks, the most amazing fruitfulness happens when the good soil takes what was given away and lets it bear fruit. 30, 60, 100-fold. Do you know why Connie and I are going to take that card so seriously? It's off aside. Because every year it gives us a chance to think about how good has God been to us. And look at what our church is doing here to reach the world and make a harvest happen in more ways than I ever would. I want to be a part of that, and it's why this year I write a bigger number than I wrote last year. Because God's just been too good to me not to, right? Many of you feel the same way. But I'd like to ask us to consider something else. In addition to what we do in and through our church, could I invite you to join me as I'm listening to this text this week, and let's do something radical, joyous, generous, uncalculating, something our accountant would not approve. Would each of us personally seek out and say, Lord, where is the neighbor? Where is the person in the ditch you've put in front of me? Help me to see you. And what might that lead you to do? For instance, could it be that you would find someone working on minimum wage, maybe someone at the diner, someone is serving, they're working for tips. What would it be like if you gave an outrageous tip? I don't mean going from $1 to $2. I mean $1,000. Something that would make that person not just say, thank you, madam, or thank you, sir. Something that would so change and reorient them that would make them say, thank you, Jesus. And just use your imagination about what God might do that would have been way beyond almost their praying or thinking. And don't hang around for a thank you note, but go away and watch how your heart expanded as the kingdom of heaven dropped again to earth. Find the person riding the bicycle in the rain and buy him a car. Adopt a child in a third world country. Find someone moving slower than you. For some of you, that may take some looking. Open the door, be gracious, help them get all the way there, hold the umbrella for them. Or, hey, but here's one. Just on your way out of the parking lot, would you be my neighbor there? And don't honk at the person in front of you who was letting people do that. You know, what might God call you and me this week? What person in the ditch will we see in front of us? And can we see Jesus enough in them that God might allow us to just do something gregarious and joyous because we can? What would that be like? Because here's the deal. The world will never see Jesus in us until we learn how to see Jesus in them. Jim Elliot left the seminary in Wheaton, same time Billy Graham was there, felt called to his neighborhood, he thought, included some people who'd never heard the gospel in Ecuador. So he flew his plane into there, first missionary journey, went to deliver the gospel to these people in Ecuador, and they killed him. A martyr for his cause. Later, people still just came on and kept on loving, and now there's a church there. But he died. 2 nights before he died, he wrote in his daily diary a quote from a 17th century English clergyman, and the quote was this: "He is no fool who lets loose of what he cannot keep in order to keep what he cannot lose." I wonder if I've been holding too tightly to the wrong stuff. Fling it out, friends. The neighbor is waiting. And it's a wonderful day in the neighborhood.
City of